The Communist Manifesto, with Friedrich Engels, by Karl Marx. In the cold February of 1848, as revolutions trembled across Europe, two young men, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, completed a small booklet that would change the political thinking of the modern world. The Communist Manifesto was born out of crisis, hope, and defiance. Its pages carried a thunderous call to the workers of all lands, workers of the world, unite. Why was this document written? Because Europe was burning with inequality. The Industrial Revolution had given rise to great factories, but it also created vast misery among the laborers who built that wealth. Marx and Engels sought to uncover the laws of history itself, the invisible forces that made one class rule and another suffer. They believed the story of humanity was the story of class struggle, a struggle that would one day end with the victory of the working class. How did this slim pamphlet grow into one of the most influential books ever written? Because it offered more than theory, it offered a vision. It revealed the contradictions of capitalism and predicted the fall of the system itself. The suspense lies not only in its bold predictions but in the haunting question it still leaves us with today: has that revolution truly come, or is it still on its way? Chapter 1: The Spectre of Communism, Class Struggle Through the Ages. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. With that single, thunderous sentence, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels began a revolution of thought that still echoes across the modern world. But to understand why that spectre appeared, why it frightened kings and industrialists, and why it inspired workers to dream of liberation, we must step back and look at the story of humanity itself. Because at its core, the Communist Manifesto is not just a political pamphlet, it is the story of history written in the language of struggle, the eternal battle between those who own and those who labor. 1. The Great Divide of Human History. From the moment humans began to build societies, a line was drawn, invisible but powerful, between the few who ruled and the many who served. In the ancient world, this line was clear and brutal. There were masters and there were slaves. Empires like Rome thrived on conquest and labor, wealth flowed upward while the sweat of millions built the marble cities. Freedom for one class existed only because another class was chained. As history moved forward, slavery slowly gave way to new systems, but the pattern didn't die. It merely changed its costume. The fall of Rome gave birth to feudalism, a world where kings and lords owned the land, and peasants worked it. These peasants, or serfs, were tied to the soil, owing labor and loyalty to their masters. Life was predictable, yes, but suffocating. The serf's child was born to the same fate as his father, to work the land for someone else's benefit. Marx and Engels described this historical pattern as the engine of history itself: class struggle. Every society, they said, is built on this conflict. One group controls the means of production, land, tools, factories, while another must sell its labor just to survive. And whenever this tension grows too great, history erupts in revolts, reforms, and revolutions. 2. The birth of the bourgeoisie. By the time the 18th century dawned, a new force was rising in Europe: the bourgeoisie, or the middle class of merchants, bankers, and industrialists. They were not nobles, they did not inherit their power from ancient bloodlines. Instead, they gained it through commerce, innovation, and risk. They built ships, traded goods, and invested in machines. They challenged the old aristocracy and demanded a new kind of freedom, not for peasants, but for themselves: the freedom to buy, sell, and profit without the king's permission. This was the age of the Industrial Revolution, a time when steam engines replaced muscles, and factories replaced workshops. The bourgeoisie harnessed science, technology, and colonial expansion to reshape the entire planet. They tore down the old feudal world not out of charity, but out of necessity. The medieval order had become too small, too slow, too rigid for the new forces of production they were unleashing. For Marx, this was the genius and the tragedy of the bourgeoisie. They were revolutionaries in their own way. They destroyed superstition and monarchy, broke down feudal walls, and created a global economy that connected nations. Yet, at the same time, they created a new form of oppression more dynamic, more efficient, and in some ways, more cruel than any before it. The old serf had been bound to a lord, the new worker was bound to a wage. 3. A world transformed and torn apart. The rise of capitalism was like setting fire to the entire structure of human society. Everything solid melted into air. Every tradition, every faith, every bond that once tied human beings to one another was shaken, redefined, or destroyed. Marx and Engels saw it everywhere. Old villages turned into industrial cities. Family trades were swallowed by great factories. The rhythms of the earth sunrise, sunset, the slow turning of the seasons were replaced by the cold tick of the factory clock. Workers were no longer artisans with pride in their craft. They became cogs in a vast machine, each performing a repetitive task, easily replaceable by the next desperate soul seeking a wage. And yet, the system produced wonders. It gave the world the railways, the telegraph, global trade routes, and an explosion of scientific discovery. But it also produced misery-crowded slums, child labor, poverty wages, and hunger in the shadow of great wealth. It was a paradox of progress. The same society that could build palaces could not feed its workers. To Marx, this contradiction was not an accident, it was the heart of capitalism itself. He believed the system was built on exploitation, that profit could exist only when the laborer was paid less than the value of what he produced. In that gap between the worker's effort and the capitalist's gain lay the injustice that would one day bring the system down. For the awakening of the proletariat. Every system creates the forces that will destroy it. For the bourgeoisie, that force was the proletariat, the working class. These were the men, women, and children who labored in the mills, mines, and foundries. They owned nothing but their hands, their strength, and their time, and they sold these, day after day, to survive. In the beginning, the workers were scattered, uneducated, and powerless. But capitalism, Marx said, had a strange effect, it brought them together. The factory gathered hundreds under one roof. The city packed thousands into close quarters. The same machines that enslaved them also connected them. Slowly, painfully, they began to see their shared condition. Strikes began. Unions formed. Voices rose demanding better pay, shorter hours, dignity. The ruling class responded with fear and repression, sometimes with bullets. But each confrontation taught the workers something vital: they were many, and their masters were few. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels describe the proletariat not only as victims but as the potential saviors of society. Unlike previous oppressed classes, the workers could not simply replace one ruling group with another. They had no property to protect, no wealth to defend. Their liberation, Marx believed, would mean the liberation of everyone, the end of class itself. 5. The global drama of capitalism. One of Marx's most astonishing insights, one that still feels prophetic today, was his vision of globalization. In 1848, the world was already being knit together by trade, migration, and technology. Cotton from India was spun in British mills. Coal mined in Wales fueled steamships crossing to America. A banker in London could ruin a farmer in Bengal with a decision made in a single afternoon. Capitalism, Marx wrote, creates a world in its own image. It tears down local industries and imposes a single world market. It spreads technology, but also dependency. It forces every nation willingly or not to adopt the logic of profit. In this sense, Marx and Engels were among the first to describe what we now call globalization. They saw both its brilliance and its brutality. And yet, they also saw its consequence, the global worker. Just as capitalism was uniting the markets of the world, it was also uniting its laborers. From Paris to Manchester, from Berlin to New York, the same struggle was being waged: long hours, low pay, dangerous work. It was no longer the story of one nation. It was the story of a species learning its strength. 6. The bourgeois paradox. Despite their revolutionary origins, the bourgeoisie were ultimately trapped by their own creation. They had unleashed forces of production so powerful that no government, no church, no tradition could fully control them. Every few decades, crises would erupt: economic collapses caused not by scarcity, but by abundance. Factories produced too much, markets overflowed, workers couldn't afford to buy the goods they made. Capitalism would stumble, recover, and stumble again, always with greater intensity. Marx and Engels saw in this pattern a fatal flaw. The bourgeoisie were like magicians who could not control their own spells. To survive, they had to keep expanding, finding new markets, cheaper labor, more resources. In doing so, they spread their system across the earth, but they also deepened its contradictions. They believed that one day, this expansion would reach its limit. When the working class realized its collective power, when the majority no longer accepted the rule of the few, the very foundations of capitalism would shake. 7. The ghost that would not die. So when Marx wrote, "A specter is haunting Europe," he was not talking about superstition. He was describing the idea of communism, an idea that terrified the rulers because it revealed the truth they wished to hide, that their wealth depended on the labor of others. The specter was not a phantom, it was the shadow of reality. By 1848, that shadow was everywhere. Workers' movements were rising across Europe. Revolutions were breaking out in France, Germany, and Italy. The old monarchies were under siege, and the ruling class whispered of a coming storm. In that atmosphere of fear and hope, the Communist Manifesto appeared, a book that named the specter, gave it voice, and declared its purpose. Communism, Marx and Engels wrote, is not a conspiracy. It is the natural conclusion of history. It is the moment when humanity finally takes control of its own destiny, when the division between ruler and ruled, owner and worker, finally ends. 8. The eternal relevance. Now, more than a century and a half later, the world has changed, but the questions remain eerily familiar. Factories have become offices, machines have become algorithms, and yet the inequality between labor and capital persists. The struggle continues, sometimes in the streets, sometimes in silence. And the specter of communism still lingers, not as a ghost of the past, but as a question for the future. Was Marx right? Will the contradictions of capitalism one day bring about its own undoing? Or has the system evolved to survive indefinitely, fueled by consumerism and technology? The manifesto does not answer these questions, it provokes them. It forces us to look at the structure of our world and ask, who truly benefits, and at whose cost? 9. The story so far. By the end of this first chapter, we see the shape of history as Marx and Engels understood it, not as a series of random events, but as a drama of classes. From slave to serf, from serf to worker, from lord to capitalist, each era has carried within it the seeds of its own transformation. And now, they argued, a new era was dawning, one that would not just change the rulers, but end the system of rule itself. The specter of communism, then, is more than a metaphor. It is the whisper of history in our ear, reminding us that no power lasts forever, and no system is beyond question. It is the voice of the oppressed, rising through centuries of silence, declaring, "We have nothing to lose but our chains." Chapter 2, The Rise of the Bourgeoisie and the Chains of Capitalism. The story of the modern world, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels tell us, begins not with kings or empires, but with a new class, a restless, ambitious, and transformative class, the bourgeoisie. These were the merchants, the factory owners, the financiers, the entrepreneurs of early Europe. They were neither nobles nor peasants, neither rulers, nor ruled in the old sense. And yet, within a few centuries, they would overthrow the old order, dominate the earth, and reshape human life more radically than any emperor or general ever could. This is their story and the story of the chains they unknowingly forged for themselves and for the world. 1. The makers of the modern age. When Marx and Engels looked around them in 1848, they saw the triumph of the bourgeoisie everywhere. Feudalism, the system that had ruled Europe for 1,000 years, was crumbling. The aristocracy, once the unquestioned masters of land and tradition, were being replaced by men who owned not castles, but capital. Wealth no longer came from land and birth, but from industry and investment. The motto of the age was simple: profit is power. Factories rose like cathedrals of a new faith. The air of industrial cities trembled with the clang of metal, the hiss of steam, and the hum of machinery. Coal, iron, cotton, these became the sacred materials of a new civilization. The bourgeoisie were its priests, engineers, and prophets. To Marx, this was one of humanity's most astonishing transformations. The bourgeoisie had accomplished more in a few centuries than all previous generations combined. They have created more massive and more colossal productive forces, he wrote, than have all preceding generations together. Steamships cut across oceans. Railroads stitched continents together. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than the wind. The bourgeoisie, in their hunger for profit, had created a world of miracles. But these miracles came at a cost. Every machine that increased wealth also deepened inequality. Every invention that connected the world also enslaved it more tightly to the logic of the market. What looked like progress was, in truth, a chain polished, efficient, and invisible. 2. The destruction of the old world. Capitalism does not coexist peacefully with tradition, it devours it. The bourgeoisie, Marx observed, cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. Unlike previous ruling classes, who wanted stability, they thrive on change. Innovation is their oxygen. Competition is their heartbeat. But that same hunger for change means that nothing, no custom, no religion, no family bond remains untouched. All fixed, fast frozen relations, Marx wrote, are swept away. The world becomes liquid, dynamic, unstable, and endlessly new. Imagine the medieval farmer, whose life was measured by the turning of the seasons, suddenly thrown into a factory where time is measured by the clock. Imagine a craftsman, proud of his skill, replaced overnight by a machine that produces in 1 hour what his hands could not make in a week. Imagine a merchant's family that has traded in one town for generations suddenly competing with merchants from across oceans. That shock, that endless transformation is the true face of capitalism. This was not mere economics, it was a psychological revolution. Old values, faith, honor, loyalty, community began to lose their grip. What replaced them was exchange value. Everything became a transaction. Friendships, marriages, even art, all could be priced, bought, or sold. The bourgeoisie reduced all that is solid, every belief once considered eternal, into air. It's easy to see why Marx and Engels wrote with both awe and horror. They admired the creative energy of the bourgeoisie, yet they feared its destructive hunger. It was like watching a brilliant inventor who cannot stop building, even when his machines threaten to consume him. 3. The bourgeoisie's global conquest. The rise of the bourgeoisie did not stop at Europe's borders. Capitalism, Marx said, is like a fire, it cannot stay contained, it must spread. The markets of one country were never enough. To survive, the system required new resources, new workers, and new consumers. So, the bourgeoisie went outward, conquering not through armies alone, but through trade, technology, and credit. Colonialism became the dark twin of capitalism. The same ships that carried textiles to India carried cotton back to England, extracted by cheap labor. The same global system that created jobs in Manchester destroyed industries in Bengal. Marx saw it with ruthless clarity. Capitalism creates a world market, but it does so by uprooting entire civilizations and forcing them into its orbit. And yet, paradoxically, this expansion also united humanity for the first time in history. Ideas, goods, and technologies began to circulate on a planetary scale. A crisis in London could now shake markets in New York or Calcutta. The bourgeoisie had built the world's first truly global system, a single web of production, consumption, and exchange. But beneath this unity was an enormous tension. While the bourgeoisie connected the world, they also divided it more deeply between rich and poor, colonizer and colonized, ruler and ruled. The fruits of globalization were shared unequally, and the seeds of rebellion were sown across continents. 4. The workers' chains. As factories multiplied, so did the proletariat, the working class. The same progress that enriched the bourgeoisie reduced millions to dependence and exhaustion. The worker became, in Marx's words, a mere appendage of the machine. Life in early industrial cities was brutal. Men, women, and even children worked 16-hour shifts in dim, dangerous workshops. The air was thick with smoke. Accidents were common, wages were low. There were no protections, no weekends, no sense of security. The worker's value was measured by output, nothing more. But Marx and Engels saw something revolutionary hidden in this misery. The workers, they argued, were learning something vital, something the old peasants never could. They were learning collective power. They labored side by side, depended on one another, and suffered together. Capitalism, without intending to, was creating its own gravedigger. Every strike, every protest, every demand for justice was a sign of awakening. As the bourgeoisie grew richer, the proletariat grew more conscious. They began to see that their individual struggles for bread, for safety, for dignity were part of a much larger conflict. They began to see themselves as a class. This was the hidden engine of the manifesto, the belief that capitalism is not just an economic system, but a stage in history. It creates both the conditions of its dominance and the seeds of its destruction. The worker, who builds the wealth of others, will one day demand to control that wealth himself. 5. Capitalism's contradictions. Marx was fascinated by the paradoxes of capitalism. He saw it as the most dynamic and creative system ever invented, but also the most unstable. The bourgeoisie must constantly expand production to survive, yet this very expansion creates crises. Factories overproduce. Markets overflow. Goods pile up unsold because workers who are also consumers are too poor to buy them. The result is a strange, recurring pattern of boom and bust, prosperity followed by panic, growth followed by collapse. When the crisis comes, millions lose their jobs while warehouses overflow with goods. The system breaks not because of scarcity, but because of excess. It is like a machine that chokes on its own abundance. For Marx and Engels, these crises are not accidents, they are symptoms of a deeper flaw. The profit motive, the heartbeat of capitalism, drives endless production without concern for human need. The system values exchange, not existence, efficiency, not empathy. The logic of the market overrides the logic of life. And yet, the bourgeoisie cannot escape this trap. To solve each crisis, they must find new markets, new investments, and new ways to exploit labor. Each solution only postpones the inevitable and makes the next collapse even greater. 6. The cultural revolution of capitalism. It's tempting to think of capitalism as merely economic, but Marx and Engels saw it as a total culture. It reshapes how people think, feel, and even dream. Under feudalism, identity came from place and tradition. A farmer belonged to his village, a craftsman to his guild, a monk to his order. But under capitalism, everything is mobile. People migrate to cities, chase jobs, and measure themselves by income. Success becomes the ultimate moral law. This transformation is subtle but profound. The market doesn't just sell goods, it sells meaning. It teaches us to value novelty over permanence, quantity over quality, image over essence. Even our relationships begin to mirror transactions. We invest in people, spend time, and expect returns. Marx understood this better than most. He saw capitalism as a magician that turns human beings into abstractions, into buyers and sellers, producers and consumers. In the process, something deeply human is lost. What remains is a world that is efficient, but hollow, connected, but lonely. And yet, this system also unleashes enormous creative power. Science, technology, art, and communication flourish under capitalism. The question Marx leaves us with is not whether capitalism is brilliant, it is but whether its brilliance can ever be separated from its cruelty. 7. The hidden solidarity of suffering. Out of this storm of change and contradiction emerges the potential for something new, not merely rebellion, but transformation. The workers' shared experience of alienation, Marx argued, would give rise to class consciousness, a sense of we. Once the workers understood that their individual fates were bound together, they could organize first into unions, then into movements, then into revolutions. And when that happened, history itself would turn. The bourgeoisie, Marx and Engels wrote, produces its own grave diggers. The very success of capitalism would prepare the way for its overthrow. To many, this sounded like prophecy. To others, it sounded like madness. But Marx's point was not mystical, it was logical. Every ruling class in history had eventually fallen not because of moral failure, but because it could no longer manage the forces it had unleashed. The same would happen, he claimed, to the bourgeoisie. 8. The unfinished revolution. Looking back now, over a century later, we can see both the truth and the tension in Marx's vision. The bourgeoisie did not vanish. The workers did not unite to abolish capitalism. But his description of the system's logic, its drive to expand, its crises, its cultural reach remains hauntingly accurate. Today, the bourgeoisie wears new clothes. They are CEOs instead of factory owners, investors instead of merchants, digital billionaires instead of industrialists. But the dynamics are familiar: profit above all, innovation as survival, markets that span the planet. The proletariat has changed to gig workers, coders, delivery drivers, and call center employees, but their condition still echoes Marx's warning: they make the world run, yet own almost nothing of it. Capitalism has survived by adapting. It gives comfort to some, distraction to others, and the illusion of choice to all. But beneath the surface, the same struggle continues: the ancient conflict between labor and capital, between those who control production and those who must sell their time to live. 9 Closing thoughts, the fire and the shadow. The rise of the bourgeoisie was one of the most explosive events in human history. It liberated humanity from feudal chains but replaced them with invisible ones. It unleashed science, progress, and democracy, but also greed, alienation, and exploitation. It built skyscrapers, satellites, and algorithms, and yet, in the shadows of its triumph, millions still live in precarity. Marx and Engels did not write the Communist Manifesto to condemn progress. They wrote it to expose its contradictions, to remind us that every invention has a human cost, and every system has a breaking point. The bourgeoisie changed the world, yes. But in doing so, they also created the one force capable of changing it again, the collective power of the people. The chains they forged could also become the instruments of freedom. And so the chapter closes where the next begins, on the edge of transformation. If chapter 1 was the story of history's recurring struggle, and chapter 2 the tale of capitalism's triumph and torment, then the next chapter asks the final question. What comes after? What does it mean to imagine a world beyond profit, a world where humanity, at last, owns itself? Chapter 3, the Communist Vision, Unity, Revolution, and the Future of Humanity. The story so far has carried us through centuries of conflict, from the slave and the master to the lord and the serf, from the serf and the lord to the worker and the capitalist. In each age, a ruling class has risen, built its power, and eventually fallen. Now, in the modern world, the last of those ruling classes, the bourgeoisie, stands at the height of its glory and the edge of its crisis. What, then, comes next? What lies beyond capitalism's towers of glass and steel, beyond its restless hunger and endless cycles of boom and bust? In this final chapter, we turn to the question that haunted the 19th century and still echoes in our own: what is communism truly, deeply, and humanly? 1. The birth of an idea. In 1848, communism was not an empire, not a party, not a state. It was an idea, a bold, dangerous, electrifying idea. To most Europeans, it sounded like heresy, a call to abolish private property, overturn the social order, and unite workers across the world. To Marx and Engels, however, it was something far grander and more humane. Communism was not about chaos or vengeance. It was about liberation, the freeing of humanity from systems that made people into instruments of profit. It was, as they described it, the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. That movement wasn't a single uprising or political campaign, it was a force already at work within history, the awakening of the working class, the slow realization that the old order could not last. Marx saw communism not as a dream, but as a destiny, the natural conclusion of history's long story of struggle. If the first chapter of humanity was the era of scarcity and domination, then communism, he believed, would be the beginning of freedom, a world where production serves need, not greed. 2. What communism is and isn't. Before explaining what communism aimed to build, Marx and Engels felt compelled to explain what it was not. Their opponents accused communists of wanting to destroy civilization, religion, family, and individuality. But Marx replied sharply, those institutions had already been hollowed out by capitalism itself. Capitalism, he said, had already turned everything sacred into a commodity. It was not the communists who destroyed family bonds, it was the factory that tore parents from their children and forced women and men into endless labor. It was not communism that undermined morality, it was the market that taught people to measure virtue in money and success in profit. Communism, then, was not the enemy of human values. It was their defender. It sought to restore what had been lost: community, equality, dignity, and shared purpose by changing the structure of society itself. At its core, communism meant the abolition of private property, but not in the sense of taking away everyone's personal belongings or homes. Marx was not talking about your shoes, your book, or your house. He was talking about the ownership of the means of production: the factories, the land, the machines, and the resources that make wealth possible. As long as those remained in the hands of a few, he argued, inequality would persist. To abolish that ownership was not to steal from the rich, but to end the system that allowed anyone to live off another's labor. 3. The revolutionary moment. Every great change in history, Marx believed, happens when material conditions become unbearable, when the system can no longer sustain its contradictions. In 1848, the world was already trembling with revolt. Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Milan, the old cities of Europe, were alive with protest. The working class was small but growing, and their demands were echoing across borders: better wages, shorter hours, suffrage, dignity. Marx and Engels saw in these struggles the early signs of something world-shaking: the possibility that the working class, united across nations, could overthrow the bourgeois order entirely. But this revolution, they insisted, would be unlike any before it. Previous revolutions had simply replaced one ruling class with another: nobles overthrown by merchants, kings replaced by parliaments. The communist revolution, by contrast, would abolish the very structure of class itself. For the first time in history, humanity would rule collectively, not as master and slave, not as employer and employee, but as equals. This was not a romantic vision of sudden chaos or bloodshed. It was a process: the awakening of class consciousness, the organization of workers, the creation of new political forms. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, Marx declared, and a world to win. For the communist program, a blueprint for change. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels offered a set of immediate steps: not the final vision of communism, but the path toward it. These included ideas that today seem almost ordinary, but were radical in their time. Progressive taxation, the rich contributing more to society's needs. Free education for all children. The abolition of child labor. The centralization of credit in the hands of the people, not private banks. The expansion of public infrastructure: transport, communication, and land for collective benefit rather than private profit. Each of these, Marx argued, would weaken the power of the bourgeoisie and strengthen the collective will of the working class. Step by step, the logic of profit would give way to the logic of community. In a fully communist society, production would no longer be driven by market competition but by human need. The guiding principle would be simple yet profound. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. That single sentence, so often quoted and misunderstood, expressed Marx's entire moral vision. Work would no longer be a burden but a contribution. Wealth would no longer separate people but connect them. Society would finally become human again, not a machine for accumulation, but a living organism of cooperation. 5. The human dream behind the theory. For all its fierce language and economic analysis, the Communist Manifesto is, at heart, a deeply human document. It is not written by cold theorists, but by men who believed passionately in the capacity of ordinary people to build a better world. Behind Marx's logic was empathy. He had seen poverty in the streets of London: children working in factories, women living in crowded basements, men dying in the mines. He understood that capitalism's triumph was not a victory for humanity, but for a small fraction of it. Communism, to him, was not about envy or revenge. It was about restoring balance, ensuring that the genius and effort of humanity served everyone, not just a few shareholders. Engels, his co-author, had seen the same thing firsthand in Manchester's factories. He described workers living in dark, filthy holes beside the mills whose owners dined in luxury. For both men, communism was not an abstract theory, it was a moral necessity. At its most idealistic, communism promised to free people not only from economic chains but from psychological ones, from the alienation that came from being treated as a tool rather than a person. A true society, they imagined, would allow every individual to flourish creatively, spiritually, and socially. 6. The misunderstood legacy. In the centuries since its publication, the Communist Manifesto has been both celebrated and condemned. It has inspired revolutions, reforms, and movements, but also been used to justify regimes far removed from Marx's original vision. Marx's communism was not about dictatorships or centralized tyranny. It was about democratic control, people collectively deciding how to use the wealth they create. It was not about suppressing individuality, but freeing it from the pressures of survival. The tragedies of the 20th century, the purges, the authoritarian states, the failed economies, were distortions, not fulfillments, of his idea. Yet the persistence of inequality, even in the capitalist world, keeps that idea alive. The real question, Marx might argue today, is not whether communism failed, but whether capitalism has truly succeeded. Billions still live in poverty. Wealth accumulates in fewer hands. Technology promises liberation, yet often delivers anxiety and exploitation. The old ghosts he wrote about still haunt the modern world, only now they wear digital masks. 7. The global vision. Workers of the world, unite. Perhaps the most famous words in the entire manifesto are its final ones. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. It is both a command and a prayer. Marx and Engels envisioned a future where national boundaries, racial divisions, and cultural prejudices would dissolve under the recognition of a shared struggle. They saw capitalism as global, and so the response must also be global. Solidarity, they believed, was the ultimate weapon, the only force capable of countering the fragmentation and competition that capitalism breeds. This internationalism was revolutionary in 1848 and remains radical today. It called for empathy across continents, for workers in Manchester to see their reflection in workers in India or China. In a world increasingly interlinked by trade and technology, that call feels more urgent than ever. 8. The philosophical core. Freedom and human essence. Beneath the political and economic analysis lies Marx's deepest question: what does it mean to be free? Under capitalism, he argued, we appear free to sell our labor, free to choose our work, but that freedom is hollow. It is the freedom of necessity. The worker must work to live, and so the choice is not real. True freedom, Marx believed, would come only when work becomes self-expression rather than survival, when people can develop their abilities without fear, without exploitation, without coercion. Communism, in this philosophical sense, was not simply an economic reform. It was a redefinition of what it means to be human. It aimed to end alienation, the separation between what we create and what we are. In a truly communal world, people would no longer be divided by property, profit, or class. They would be united by shared purpose, not forced, but chosen. 9. The future beyond the manifesto. When Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto, they knew their words would outlive them. They did not expect immediate triumph, they expected struggle, resistance, and transformation. History since then has been turbulent. Revolutions rose and fell, ideologies collided, capitalism adapted, technology transformed the landscape. Yet the questions the manifesto asked remain unanswered. Why does wealth still concentrate? Why do people still feel alienated amid abundance? Why does progress so often coexist with despair? Perhaps that is the real power of the Communist Manifesto, not that it gave a single solution, but that it forced humanity to keep asking the hardest questions about justice, meaning, and the purpose of society itself. Even in the 21st century, the specter of communism still lingers not as a threat, but as a reminder that the dream of equality, cooperation, and human dignity has never died. It changes shape, wears new names: socialism, social democracy, cooperative economy, but the yearning remains the same. 10. The final vision: a world to win. And so, after all the analysis, the theory, and the thunderous rhetoric, the Communist Manifesto closes not in despair but in hope. It ends not with destruction, but with creation. Marx and Engels imagined a world beyond fear, a world where labor is shared, wealth is distributed, and creativity is free. A world where education, art, and science serve all, not a privileged few. A world, in short, where humanity finally becomes what it has always been capable of being. They knew such a world would not come easily. They knew that power never yields without struggle. But they also believed that history itself, the long, painful evolution of human society, was moving in that direction. The workers, they wrote, have nothing to lose but their chains. And with that, they offered one of the most powerful conclusions in political literature: not a prophecy, but a possibility. The manifesto ends as it began, with a specter, but now, it is no longer haunting Europe in fear. It is guiding it in hope. The specter of communism, in the truest sense, is the spirit of humanity refusing to accept injustice as destiny. It is the eternal whisper that says, another world is possible.